talk maybe a little bit about the economy and the spending that we're seeing?
Yeah. So, Robert, I think my biggest question, I've referenced this on the show a number of times, is this extraordinary concern I have about the fiscal deficit and the debt level of the U.S. Running deficits north of $1 trillion a year, 33 trillion in total debt. Some people use the debt to GDP metric, which, at this point is approaching or has exceeded 130%. And 52 nations that have reached that level of debt to GDP, only one of them has not had to restructure their currency or restructure their debt payments. Obviously, with the debt ceiling approaching and some fiscal conservatives using this moment as a point to try and generate leverage, I guess my biggest question for the country now and going forward is, do we actually have the ability to pursue all of these interests on a social, a geopolitical, a security agenda, and do so without having either a balanced budget or a plan that says, here are the boundaries and here are the boundary conditions? Because in the last couple of years, and particularly in the last 5 years, we've seen almost like a bipartisan, unmitigated spending spree that, is largely driven to do what the electorate wants, which is to give people stuff. And giving people stuff costs money, and that money has to be paid back at some point. I guess, how do you think about the importance of this? And how do you think about the boundary conditions that you would, look to articulate and impose as you, think about this role with respect to the deficit spending and the debt levels for this country?
In terms of a boundary, I would love to hear arguments about that, but as you say, I think the debt is now 32 trillion. The GDP, our GDP is around 25 trillion. So that's just a really alarming ratio. If you look at why, the primary cause are our military expenditures. We're spending this year, I think, $8.4 trillion on the military budget this year. But if you throw in the Homeland Security and all the surveillance and security expenditures at home, it's 1.1 trillion a year. That's 1.1 trillion a year that is attributable to essentially to our warmongering. And I don't think we can afford to be policemen of the world anymore. We have 800 bases around the world. We need to start rebuilding our middle class at home. We need to be responsible with our debt. And my grandfather always said, we should make America too expensive to conquer. We should make Fortress America. We should arm America to the teeth at home so we're too expensive to conquer. And then we should concentrate on building up our economic power and a robust middle class. That's what's going to make America strong. And instead of projecting military strength abroad, we ought to be projecting our economic strength and a marketplace of ideas and economic power. Right now we're borrowing $6 billion a day, mainly from the Chinese and Japanese, just to serve the interest on that debt. That's not a healthy thing for America to be, and we got to figure out, a way to impose fiscal discipline. But I can't tell you exactly what my boundaries would be. That's something I need to think about.
But how do you think about that? Like, I think of discretionary spending, defense is about 800 billion, non-defense is about 900 billion. And then obviously there's Social Security benefits, Medicare, Medicaid. In order to get the budget balanced, you think cutting defense would be kind of the first priority and you could kind of get there through that approach? But there still seems to be a big gap to me on, given how much we're spending, on how do we actually get there? Are we ultimately going to have to kind of change retirement benefits, restructure Medicare, Medicaid, or are we going to raise taxes, or are we going to do all three to get to this point? Otherwise, we have this obviously kind of never-ending debt spiral that's going to cause a massive crisis, whether it's not this year, maybe it's in 5 years or 10 years. Right now, it's projected Social Security will go bankrupt in 2035, 2034, around that range. So this is coming up fast. What are we going to be cutting besides defense? Or are we going to be raising taxes to 70%, do you think, to kind of bridge this hole?
I can't answer that question any better than I already have. I think there are targets for opportunity in the homeland security. I think once we stop fighting these wars all over the world, there's a lot less need for us to have a surveillance state at home. So the real cost in the military is $1.1 trillion a year, not just the $800 trillion that shows up on the books. And I think those are targets for opportunity. And I can't, I need to study more the issue about how to get back into a balanced budget. One of the things I'd say disturbs me is that I don't think we should be playing chicken in Congress about raising the debt ceiling. Because I don't think we should mess around with the full faith and credit of the United States, particularly at this point in time.
One of the things that's happened in the world, Bobby, is that there's been a couple of countries, France is probably the best example, that had to raise the retirement age. And irrespective of the view that one has on whether that was right or wrong, the practical reality of doing it is just that when these initial social safety nets were passed, the average life expectancy of folks was 10, 15 years less than what they are today. And presumably, as we keep inventing technologies, folks are going to live to 80, 90, 100 years on average, which may seem implausible, but is likely if you look at the trend. I'm just curious how you think about the state of our social safety net and what has to change, what would you keep the same, and what has to be totally reimagined for what the world will look like in 30 or 40 years?
I would say it's a red line for me to touch Social Security or Medicaid or Medicare. I think we need to take care of people, particularly people who have spent their whole life paying into a system with a promise at the end of it and have worked hard and saved and done what they were supposed to do. I don't think it's right to pull the rug out from under them. But again, this is an issue that I need to spend more time looking at and studying. Maybe the next time I come back here, I'll have a better answer for you guys.
I think this is my concern is, sorry, but Robert, the comment you just made is the same comment I hear from both sides of the aisle, that we can't touch Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, because it would be so unpopular we wouldn't get elected. And that's ultimately kind of what a democracy like ours may lead to, is that folks vote and elect representatives that are going to create these systems that benefit them. But in aggregate, we may not be able to support those benefits over time and at scale. And we may be facing that moment sooner than any of us want to. And I think it's one of the more pressing issues and concerns, not just for the United States, but for the global economy, that if the US doesn't resolve this massive hole, talking about Social Security, for example, going bankrupt in the next 12 years as one acute example of that problem set, we may not be able to turn it around. And I mean, do you think that politics is set up to solve these structural economic problems that the US is now facing? Because so much of politics ends up leading towards what additional benefits can I provide to the folks that get me elected?
Here's the thing, is we spent $8 trillion in the war in Iraq. $8 trillion, and we got nothing for it.
Yeah, that's pretty nuts. That's nuts.
In fact, we got worse than nothing. We killed more Iraqis than Saddam Hussein. We killed 1 million Iraqis, probably. We created ISIS. We turned Iraq into a proxy for Iran, which is exactly what we've been not trying to do for 40 years. And we drove 2 million refugees with the Iraq war and its aftermath, Syria and Yemen and, Pakistan and Afghanistan, 2 million refugees to Europe, destabilized democracy in Europe. Then we go ahead, so $8 trillion there. We spent $16 trillion on the pandemic, on the lockdown, and got nothing in return. So that's $24 trillion. And now we're doing bank bailouts every, couple of months. The Silicon Valley Bank